Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to this latest Work Foundation event, looking at how insecure work, and in particular long-term insecure work, is playing out across the UK. My name is Ben Harrison. I'm the director at the Work Foundation. We're a policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University, based within the Management School. We're committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid and secure employment, and our current research and engagement programme is particularly focused on job insecurity for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market, as well as the interrelationship between health and work. And of course, we're meeting today on the eve of the government's first budget, where in a whole host of ways the stakes could barely be higher. We know that the UK faces a series of really significant challenges, and amongst the big aims of the new government, of course, are to reset the public finances, prioritise growth, and ultimately improve public services as well. And alongside those big aims, we've also seen the government set out major ambitions to increase the rate of employment to 80%, in their own terms, to make work pay, and to tackle inactivity via a new Get Britain Working reform agenda. Now, Work Foundation evidence suggests that addressing insecure work will be key to realising all of those ambitions. Over the course of the last 4 years, we've produced a range of research aimed at understanding more about insecure work in the 21st century. In 2022, we launched our first UK Insecure Work Index, which provided a new measure of insecurity, taking into account not just things like 0 hours contracts, which are very often the shorthand for insecure work, but also things like levels of pay, predictability of hours, and access to key employment rights, trying under the skin of what the real level of insecurity across the UK labour market is. The index finds that around 1 in 5 UK workers are in severely insecure work, meaning that they face a combination of those more serious insecure indicators. But it also highlights that insecurity is more likely to affect certain worker groups than others, including women, people from ethnic minority backgrounds, those with disabilities, and young people in particular. And we've also, throughout that period, been able to dig down further to understand the sectors where this kind of work is often concentrated, and the places across the country where we see most insecure jobs clustered. And we've also been able to add to the evidence regarding the impacts that insecure work has on people themselves, including in terms of their financial well-being and their mental health. But in our latest report, we also wanted to understand more regarding how security and quality of work contributes to long-term employment outcomes, especially in a context where we know the UK faces continued challenges around labour market participation and a rising welfare bill. And that's the piece of analysis that we want to get into further today. Aman, Navani, one of the authors of the work, is going to talk us through the detail of the key findings, as well as what we think it all means for policy. And I'm also delighted to say that we're joined by Dr Katy Jones, who's head of the Decent Work and Productivity Research Centre at Manchester Metropolitan University, to get her insights and reflections on this important agenda as well. Before I hand over to Aman, just to say that we will be recording the session today, and if you want to ask a question during the session, please do using the Q&A function. And once we've heard from our initial reflections from our speakers, I'll do my best to bring you into the conversation and ask those questions on your behalf of our speakers, until they're covered during the event. For now, though, over to you, Aman, and we'll hear more about the findings of the research.
Thank you, Ben. I'm just going to share my screen. So before we get into the key research findings of the paper, I just wanted to speak a bit about the context and motivation behind the project. So, of course, we face numerous sorts of labour market challenges in the UK. We estimate there are around 6.8 million workers in severely insecure work. And over the last decade before the pandemic, there was an increase in the employment rate, but that was fueled by a rise in different forms of insecure work. And since the pandemic, we have seen a dramatic increase in economic inactivity due to long-term ill health. So we're at a near record 2.75 million economically inactive people due to long-term ill health currently. And so a huge goal of this government is to get people back into work. And the previous government's approach to this issue of getting people back into work was based on this premise that sort of any job is better than no job at all. So the priority was getting people into work regardless of the quality of work they find, because it was thought that any job could eventually lead to a better job and eventually into a career. And the current Labour government has also aimed to increase the employment rate to about 80%, which is equivalent to increasing the workforce by about 2 million. So there's a lot of emphasis on increasing employment. But we wanted to know in this piece of research how the quality of jobs that people find affect their long-term career outcomes. In other words, if people do find insecure work, is that a stepping stone to more secure work? Or do they get trapped in long-term insecurity? So a bit about our methods before we get to the key findings. So we use our flagship UK Insecure Work Index, which the Work Foundation has developed. We look at insecurity across 3 dimensions: contractual insecurity, which refers to people on temporary work contracts or part-time work; financial insecurity, which refers to people on low pay, volatile pay and hours, or people who have second jobs; and worker rights, which refers to the fact that some types of workers, like solo self-employed people, don't have the same rights and protections as full-time permanent employees. So what we did with this index was we merged it with the Understanding Society dataset, which is a longitudinal dataset asking respondents about their economic circumstances, their demographic background, and their social and political attitudes. So we isolated a cohort of insecure and secure workers in 2017, about 10,000 in total, and analyzed their employment status 4 years on in about 2021, and looked at the proportions of insecure workers who remained trapped in insecurity, who managed to progress to secure work, and then compared their trajectories with secure workers. So we now move on to some of the key findings. So our headline finding was that almost half of insecure workers, so almost half of that initial cohort of insecure workers, experienced long-term insecure work. So 44% of this cohort was still in insecure work 4 years on. A further 9% fell into involuntary worklessness, which we define as inactivity due to long-term ill health and unemployment. So you're more likely to remain trapped in insecurity or move out of work than progressing on to secure work. And the differences between secure workers and insecure workers in their career outcomes are quite stark. So if you look at secure workers, which is the left-hand donut, around 79% of the initial cohort of secure workers are still in secure work 4 years on, and only 10% fall into insecurity at the end of the period. So the employment trajectories over time of secure workers are much more favorable. And so that suggests that for those who are out of work, whether they find insecure or secure work really can have quite dramatic knock-on effects on their career trajectories over time. So we also looked at the interactions of employment status with health conditions. So we know that not only do we have a smaller workforce than pre-pandemic in the UK, we also have a sicker working age population. There are a huge number of people out of work due to ill health, but the Health Foundation has recently estimated that around 30% of workers also have work-limiting health conditions. So they're also at danger of falling out if they don't have adequate health support. So here we compared 4 groups of workers, insecure and secure workers with and without health conditions. And as you can see, insecure workers with a health condition are twice as likely to fall into involuntary worklessness relative to insecure workers without one. So there is some sort of interaction effect between insecurity and health. But it's also true that for secure workers with a health condition also have less favorable employment trajectories. They're also twice as likely to fall out of work than their secure worker counterparts without a health condition. So I think these results really reinforce the importance of occupational health support and clearing up the NHS waiting list so people have access to treatment in a timely manner. So next up, we looked at age and how age affects employment outcomes. So again, we isolated a cohort of insecure workers in 2017, looked at their end employment status 4 years on and how that differs across different age bands. So you can see for 16 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds, between 30% and 50% of insecure workers manage to escape and progress to secure work. And that number goes down to about 20% of those aged 55 to 64. So you're more likely to be trapped in insecure work the older you get. Now, this may be intuitive and somewhat expected, but we still wanted to highlight this finding because we are likely to have longer working lives in the future. The state pension age is likely to increase in the future. We might need to have more generous pension pots as life expectancy increases. And so we thought that in this context, we also need to look at this age group approaching retirement and what can be done to help them to progress to more secure forms of work. So this finding is more a sort of call to action to start the debate and think about how our working lives may play out in the future. And in fact, we recently published a report on leave policies and how we may need to reform and rethink leave policies in light of potentially leading longer working lives. So I suggest you check that out as well. Next up, we also looked at insecure work across different sectors of the economy. We wanted to investigate whether you're more likely to be trapped in insecure work over that time period if you are in certain sectors. So the green bars here look at the prevalence of insecure work at the start of the study period in each sector. The red bars look at the proportions in each sector that remain trapped in insecurity. So although it's not perfect, there seems to be a correlation between the initial prevalence of insecure work and your likelihood of being trapped in insecurity. So if you look at the IT sector on the right-hand side, very low levels of initial insecurity, and out of those who are in insecure work, only 30% remain trapped in the long run. So there does seem to be sort of problem sectors where there's a high level of insecurity and high probability of being trapped as well. So these results suggest that one of the ways to escape insecurity and progress is to move out of sectors, certain sectors altogether. So we looked at this in more detail, and we did a deep dive specifically into two sectors, the retail sector and the health and social work sector, where we know insecure work is a problem. And we found quite interestingly in both sectors, the proportions of those who escaped to another sector, most of them, 3/4 of the people who escaped sectors, were also able to escape insecurity and obtain secure work once they left the sector. So moving sectors seems to be a way out of insecurity. However, the implication of this finding is that sort of you leave problem sectors, but we know, for example, in social care, there are various workforce challenges and problems with recruitment and retention. So I think this finding reinforces the importance of coming up with a credible workforce plan in these sectors and sort of figuring out and creating progression pathways for people so they're incentivized to remain in these sectors. So before I go on to the recommendations, we thought it would be good to sort of bring the data alive. And during the course of our research, we did speak to many people who are in insecure work, and to highlight how insecure work manifests itself in their day-to-day lives. So we spoke to Jessica Burns, who's a supermarket worker and used to be a mental health support worker. And she is not on a 0 hours contract, but she has minimum guaranteed hours, but she's on variable hours and pay. And I think these quotes are really illuminating and highlight the trade-offs and tensions that people in insecurity face. So for example, she says that she gets her rota every 2 weeks. Some weeks she does 2 shifts, other weeks she has 4 shifts, and this variable hours and pay really makes it difficult to plan her monthly finances. She can't do a monthly shop anymore, has to wait for her universal credit benefit statement to work out which bills she can pay or not. She also has childcare responsibilities. She has an 11-month-old child. She has to book childcare in for certain days of the month, but she can't really plan that. So sometimes she books childcare in, but then she doesn't have any work that day and could have done childcare herself. And she said that she could reclaim that money, but she can only do that a month in advance. So you can easily see how people in insecurity can face various cash flow problems. And it really shortens your time horizon as well. It's very difficult to take time out and actually think long term and sort of take time out to look for secure employment. So this is just one of the sort of mechanisms through which insecure workers can get trapped in the long run. So lastly, we make two recommendations in the paper. One is to set up a secure work commission in order to monitor and drive improvements in access to secure work. So the idea behind this is to bring together UK government representatives, employers, trade unions, to monitor types of insecure work and the levels of insecure work in different sectors. Its ambit could include mandating that employers disclose their employment models and disclose the number of vacancies that are temporary or permanent. Perhaps even establishing sector task forces to implement changes in problem sectors, working in step with the fair pay agreements that the Labour government has been talking about, and even working closely with the Fair Work Agency, which is a new enforcement body that the government has proposed to set up. I think there's a great role for insecure work data that can be used and accessed in enforcement activities as well. The second recommendation is around the Department for Work and Pensions. We think it's very important that the DWP shifts the focus of its activities from simply administrating benefits to focus more on employment support. And we could go on about this. There probably is a separate research paper on this topic. To be fair, the new Secretary of State at the DWP, Liz Kendall, has pledged to rewire the aims of the DWP and focus more on employment support. But we also think it would be a good idea to review the work search conditionality requirements and the sanctioning regime, the sort of punitive aspects of the benefit system, and take into account when setting work conditions, the sort of quality of work that claimants have access to, whether job opportunities are compatible with their health conditions or in line with their skill sets, and perhaps also use sanctioning only as a last resort when there's clear evidence of no work search activity. So focusing and putting in more resources for employment support is all well and good. We welcome that, but there needs to be a review of the more punitive aspects of the benefit system as well. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Aman. And now we're going to hear from Katy Jones. Katy, it would be great to get your reflections on the kind of detail that Aman has gone into there in terms of this particular study around long-term insecure work. But obviously, I know you've spent many years working in this space, particularly around the welfare system and its impact on employment outcomes. So it'd be great to get your wider insights and reflections as well.
Fabulous. Thanks, Ben and Aman. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this important research. As this research shows, work insecurity, it impacts on millions of people, and it's something that we should all be much more concerned about. I think the real value of this research is that the rigorous quantitative analysis behind it shows not just the negative impact of being in insecure work at any one point in time, which I'm sure if anyone's got experience of that will certainly understand, but crucially demonstrates clearly how these impacts persist and trap people where they are instead of providing that stepping stone to move on to better quality work. This really chimes very much with a lot of the more qualitative focused research that myself and colleagues have been involved in over the past few years. So, for example, in a recent article with Sharon Wright at Glasgow University and Lisa Scullion at University of Salford, we analysed more than 100 interviews with workers who'd been pressured into taking any job as a result of our kind of work first conditionality policies. And really talking to people and following their experiences over time really helped to show us just how difficult it was to just survive in our insecure labour market, let alone progress. In other research that we've done focused on employers with Callum Carson, we spoke to employers in precisely those sectors where low pay and insecure work are so entrenched. And we, through those conversations and really trying to unpick how their employment models mapped onto some of our employment policies, we exposed how government's rigid expectations for universal credit claimants for both moving into work and increasingly thinking about how we're expecting people to progress in work too, they're often completely at odds with the kind of flexible and insecure business practices that are widely adopted in those sectors. We're doing a bit more work on research and a bit more research on this funded by the Nuffield Foundation with my colleagues Ashwin Kumar, Paul Sissons and Anne Green to really try and explore some of these links between issues to do with job quality and the way that our employment support service is functioning. Now, policymakers often point to what they often call the scarring effects of unemployment to justify that push for people to take any job. So this idea that if you spend time outside of work, it's then going to negatively impact on your employment outcomes going forward. But I think this report really exposes that insecure work creates its own scars too, and they clearly run quite deep. So we really need to think a lot more about the kinds of work that we're supporting people into. The report clearly shows there is a need for some fundamental shifts in policy, and I think it's really encouraging to see the new government's attention on both improving employment conditions and reforming employment support, but it's really critical that those reforms work together. So there's no point in kind of creating better employment when you're kind of requiring people to take any job, because it just kind of reinforces and legitimizes employers who continue to offer low quality work. I think having a clear framework for assessing job quality, as recommended in this report, is an important step towards this. It's important that not just our job centres have got a clear idea of what that is, but any policy that aims to interact with workers, people who are trying to access the labour market and employers really needs to kind of, we need to firm up on our definition of what the expectations are on the part of the employers as well as kind of service users. Employers also clearly need to step up here. So as Aman said, social care, retail, hospitality, they are all critical sectors. But at the moment, really, if we're honest, the best advice to workers in these sectors is just to leave them, which, you know, is not what anybody wants. So this really needs to change. Sector leaders really need to realise this and roll up their sleeves rather than resisting change to improved employment conditions. We really need these sectors, but their continued reliance on insecure and low-paid workers is totally unsustainable. Now, we really need to work together on this, and it's really critical that government doesn't design policy in the abstract, which I think myself and others have certainly critiqued recent policy making over the past few years. Instead, we need employers, we need trade unions, we need workers, and those currently being excluded from good quality jobs to be central to developing a robust policy response. We can't do this without everybody's input. And as part of this, we also need to shift to an approach which brings together those supply side policies focused on moving people into work and the demand side policies focused on making work better quality. So those are my kind of initial reflections, and congratulations to Aman and Rebecca for producing such a great report. I really hope that policymakers and employers sit up and pay attention, because ultimately the power is in their hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Katy. And Aman, if you can bring your camera back on, and if Katy, you leave your camera on, and I'm going to try and switch mine back on, but it's being a bit temperamental. But hopefully you can hear me okay while that comes into life. We've had a couple of questions already, actually, which I think sort of actually follow on quite nicely from some of your remarks, Katy. So I might come to you first. This issue of how work insecurity might be interrelating with inactivity and the levels of economic inactivity that we see in the UK today. I know you've done work in the past which has sort of pinpointed some elements of the welfare system where actually they may actually be playing a role which is preventing people from coming back into the labour market because they offer cliff edges within the system or make it more risky for people to take on work. But could you maybe just talk more broadly about how you see that sort of interplay between insecure work and inactivity playing out?
Sure, yeah. So we've done a lot of research, myself and colleagues in different institutions, really kind of exploring people's experiences of our welfare system. In the main, people who are kind of impacted in the by conditionality policies, but also some people who have kind of disengaged from that, and because they've had to kind of demonstrate that they're not well enough to work. And I think in terms of the way that our kind of work capability assessments and things like that have been set up, it's really kind of forced a real kind of hard line. It means people don't feel confident enough to kind of take steps into work through fear of kind of having their benefits taken away. And I think, when we think about people's labour market transitions, they're not often that kind of very linear pathway, especially if people have got health conditions or other things going on in their lives, whether it's care and responsibilities and so on. So we need to create a system that actually provides security and safety for people to engage with the labour market on the terms that they feel that they're able to, but also with employers who are offering the quality of work and the kind of work that is inclusive enough to help people with whatever kind of needs and needs that they have. I mean, I think the ideas of kind of opening up our employment support service to people who are not necessarily expected to move into the labour market immediately, as has been kind of put forward by the Institute of Employment Studies and others, is a really positive move. But I think really we've got to, that's going to take a massive shift, because people haven't really seen job centres as places that are genuinely there to help them and help them into work. So I think we've got to really think about that, think about the role of the job centre, think about the role of other agencies within that ecosystem as well. But I think there's certainly an ambition there, but it's looking at how that's put into place in also increasingly when we're thinking about moving towards more devolved approaches too.
Yeah. I'm definitely going to come back to you on that, because we've had an additional question around the role of third sector organisations in particular, and I think that fits nicely in there. But Aman, I know this sort of connection between insecure work over the long term and inactivity wasn't necessarily the focus of this project, but is there anything you would add, given the kind of findings that were generated from the work?
Absolutely. I think one of the key implications of our findings is that there is a relationship between the quality of work and inactivity, because I think insecure work in and of itself can lead to negative mental health outcomes, and it makes it very difficult for people with health conditions to manage their health condition while experiencing financial and contractual insecurity. So I think it's very likely to see people switching in and out of insecurity and worklessness. So I think if the government wants to increase the employment rate in a sort of sustained way, then they should focus on the quality of work that they support people into as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Aman. On that sort of point, Katy, that you were just touching on there about the sort of the range of actors that may need to be contributing to that employment support piece and kind of supporting people into work, what would your reflections be around the role of the third sector and other organisations? Because the question from a member of the audience is sort of getting to this idea that actually the kind of job centre, the EWP, might be quite a difficult space for people to engage with, particularly if they've had a bad experience in the past, or they're in a space where perhaps they haven't been in this process before. I was a member of the Pathways to Work Commission in Barnsley earlier this year, and that was definitely something we heard from individuals who were inactive, but also who'd just been out of work, that this system wasn't working for them. But equally, we heard from third sector organisations that funding was a real issue, kind of long-term, engagement with the government was really difficult. Tracking impact of outcomes, things like that. So there's sort of challenges all over this picture. How do we get to a kind of better space where third sector organisations are able to play their part?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I mean, I think it just speaks fundamentally, we need to really be thinking about this in a longer term way, from the top levels of policy. We can't just move people into any job and kind of hope for the best. Like, we really need to think about the support that people need and recognise that people might need that over time. And I think, third sector organisations play such an important role, especially in terms of gaining the trust of those people who are often further away from the labour market, and they're often doing that despite those cliff edges in funding, which repeatedly we've seen when we've left the EU, but now in terms of different transitions, in terms of different employment support policies, there is that important. It's really important to kind of grow and build and sustain that ecosystem, if only for a practical reason, because people then know where to go if they want to engage with an organisation to help them to move back into work. I mean, I think we're talking about third sector organisations here, but these are places where employers too should know where to go and know where to engage with. But at the moment, it's such a bitty, fragmented landscape. And people are kind of being shifted from program to program from different organisation. And it's really hard, and especially when people have got different barriers to the labour market, often very personal things that they don't want to disclose to multiple different people and different agencies all at the same time, and really developing that support and mentorship that's really important in terms of helping people to navigate quite a difficult and complex labour market, that we really need to make sure that stability is at the core. And I think, it's really great to hear kind of ministers and Secretary of States talking about getting people into the right job, but ultimately, this system needs to support much more sustained long-term work and thinking about longer-term outcomes rather than just thinking about immediate job entry.
Absolutely. Thanks, Katy. I'm just apologise if that's interfering with anybody's experience of the event, or indeed, Aman and Katy, your ability to hear me. Hopefully it isn't. But we've had a couple of other questions. Aman, I'm going to come to you first around one which we've had specifically about the data on regional insecurity and whether we actually see particular concentrations of this kind of work in parts of the country. And that is something which we've looked at in the past. So it'd be great to get a few reflections from you on that. And then, Katy, I might come back to you around some of the things you said about employers stepping up in particular sectors. So we've had a couple of questions around that in terms of how we incentivize them to do that and whether we think the employment bill will be sufficient. But Aman, I'll come to you first around the regional picture.
Yeah, so in this paper, we specifically don't look at regions, but we do have a previous research paper that we've published that looks at regional insecurity. So we looked at insecurity at the mayoral combined authority level, and we do find pockets of insecurity concentrated in certain regions like the Northeast. And we also find in that paper a correlation between high levels of insecure work and high levels of economic inactivity. And that's also due not only to the lack of employment support, perhaps, but also the lack of good jobs available. So like the demand side of the labor market is also quite important. And that speaks to the need of sort of industrial strategy, perhaps at a devolved level, and sort of more local engagement with local employers and local health support and third sector organizations to help people back into work, but also to create the good jobs that people can get back into.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aman. Katy, I'll come to you now around employment in sort of those low pay insecure sectors. And if you could pick up as well as a couple of questions around whether we think the sort of measures in the employment rights bill are going to be sort of sufficient to address some of these, or whether there's any gaps that you identify.
Big question. Yeah, look, I mean, employers are absolutely critical. to people's labour market outcomes. I think in terms of, my work around the employment support policies and conditionality, I mean, one of the first, one of the key things that they need to do is really engage with this. Like, it's not a separate, it's our kind of welfare policy has been quite a negative thing to engage with previously, but it's absolutely fundamental to helping people to kind of access and progress in work. But I think because of the kind of toxicity around that policy area, I think employers haven't really been that engaged with it, and that goes from everything from a kind of policy development level, but also in terms of, how many employers see their local job centres as a positive place to engage. So there's a need for them to really step up and see their role in really helping people to move into work. And I think that's not just about, going and offering a job through the job centre, but looking about how they can engage, more informally, especially small businesses who aren't recruiting large numbers. Really one of the things that people have shared with us in the past is how they've really valued actually speaking to an actual employer about their kind of prospects in different sectors, and even going through mock interviews with real employers rather than people who are a bit abstracted from that. So there's a really positive thing that they can be involved in terms of improving our employment support sector. It does become, but I think also there's a real need to kind of be quite introspective and honest about the kind of limitations of the work that people are offering in those sectors, and actually creating plans to improve the quality of work in different sectors is really important. But I think the employment support providers have often been positioned in a, employers have been almost like the client. So it's like, great, you've got a job, I'll help you fill it. Whereas actually, I think there's a bit more of a role that can be played to really kind of, point out, well, are you struggling with recruitment? Perhaps that's to do with policies that aren't particularly inclusive. Perhaps that's to do with, you're paying minimum wage for a job that requires people with experience. All those kind of things that I think collectively as a system we've got, we can push on, whether that's, an employment support provider, a welfare rights advisor, and so on. In terms of the new rights in the employment bill, I think one of the critical things is making sure that these rights are enforced. And I think, the idea of kind of embedding employment rights within employability support, like, has almost seemed to be like a radical thing, but actually that's really where we need to shift to, I think, and really making sure that, workers are equipped to kind of navigate and move away from more kind of negative practices if they can.
Thanks, Katie. That's really helpful. And I was going to mention that point around enforcement. I think the other thing, I would agree with everything you said. I think the other thing I would perhaps point to as well is that there are some examples of employers within those sectors that are already moving to try and reduce the amount of insecurity within their workforces and moving to different kinds of contracts and different sorts of employment models. And, they may not be perfect, but there are certainly, whether it's in hospitality or in retail or it's, moves within employers within those sectors who recognise that actually this is a bit of a barrier to their staff retention or to issues around health within their workforce or pressure with that. It is worth taking action. So hopefully that is a sense that actually it is possible. Katie, I think you want to go back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible, but I mean, just kind of reflecting on, we've done a lot of work with the Good Employment Charter here in Greater Manchester, and it's been brilliant to work with a really, really diverse group of organisations and to see how they're engaging. Again, this comes back to your point about the need for a framework around good work. As part of the Charter, there's 7 different characteristics of good work, and you can see the way that team has engaged with employers to really break down the different aspects of what job quality is, and really kind of work together and push towards better employment practices through that kind of framework. And that's really, that's something that's worked quite well locally. But then actually, if you look at the employers who signed up to that, I'm still looking for a pub to sign up to it, because that's where I'd like to go for a pint. But hospitality, retail, social care uniformly isn't signing up to these kind of more voluntary led initiatives. But I think there's a real value actually in, even if people don't feel like they've kind of met that bar, which is a high standard, to really use these things and hook onto these initiatives and look inwardly and think, actually, do I pay well? Am I offering secure work? Am I offering work that's inclusive and that helps people to progress? Like, anyone can, there's so many examples of someone going from, shop floor to management, but actually, you can pull out a case study, but how routinely is that happening? Not very, if we look at this research that Aman and Rebecca have published. And I think, we need to be really, really honest about that, because, who's gonna, if we're happy with that situation, who's gonna kind of bear the cost of it? Like, if it's not employers, is it going to be the state? Well, probably not, if we're just going to tighten up conditionality rules for people who are in work. And it's just going to be every time the worker has to kind of deal with that. And we just, it's unsustainable for people's health and well-being going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Katy. Aman, we've also had a question from Nick Paul around whether there's any data from sort of fit notes and sick pay that supports that kind of link between insecure jobs and instances of ill health. I'm not sure if that's something we've necessarily got access to, but I know through our sort of wider work on insecurity, that there is evidence emerging around the kind of impact that insecure work can have on someone's health, but also the extent to which those with health conditions end up in insecure work because they can't find secure, flexible work that they're looking for.
Absolutely. I think flexible work, or rather the lack of flexible work, is a huge issue. So too many people with health conditions face a trade-off, face a tension between managing their health condition and progressing in their careers, and are almost forced to opt into insecure work, which is a problem. On the point of sick pay, on statutory sick pay, we have spoken a lot about this in our research, the fact that statutory sick pay is one of the least generous in the OECD, and many people with health conditions are forced to return to work before they're completely ready, or are forced to drop out of work altogether and get onto health benefits. And so I think increasing the generosity of sick pay will go a long way in solving this health and work crisis.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of an answer to a previous question around gaps in the where increasing access to it, removing the minimum income threshold. But there's certainly still, I think, concerns that just the basic level of sick pay isn't high enough. And it leaves particularly those on low incomes or in precarious kinds of work in a really invidious position where probably most will feel they need to work while unwell, which obviously could then compound the issue that they're Katy, I also wanted to come back to you on, I mean, we've talked a little bit around the employment rights bill itself, but obviously we'll have the budget tomorrow, and that's going to signal some important things in terms of the amount of resources that government is committing and investment that it's committing to some of our core, etc. Get Britain working plan for another few weeks yet, and I just wondered what your sort of thoughts on what we really need to see within that plan.
Ben, you were breaking up quite a bit, but I heard the words budget and what we needed to have in it. So that's the question that I'm going to take. Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is to.
Sorry, Kate, can you hear me better now?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, just a bit. So it was really a question around the Get Britain Working plan and what we need to see in it in order to address some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to not underestimate the scale of the shift from, supporting people, requiring people to take any job, to supporting people into the right job that works for them. that is a massive shift. That is something that needs a significant amount of resource to go into, just, in terms of really reinforcing and helping the sector kind of shift and really understand what needs to be done there. I mean, I think that in terms of the resource that's required, it really needs to be something that will enable the employment support sector to shift towards that longer term, thinking about longer term outcomes, thinking about job quality as an outcome measure rather than simply work entry. And I think also the importance of really putting some resource behind different local partnerships, because I think, again, you've got this major shift towards putting the right jobs at the centre of employment support policy, but then also you've got a shift towards greater devolution of employment support and those kind of local area plans. But different local authorities, different combined authorities have got really different kind of capabilities and resources already in play. So I think what that looks like in different areas is going to be quite different as well. So ensuring that has kind of been thought through and there's kind of enough effective resource, but also the scaffolding around, what we understand by job quality, I think is really central to that as well. So I think, I know there's been some announcements, I think yesterday, around increased support for employment support, but I think really ensuring that, it is enough to deliver on those two big shifts, I think is really important.
Fantastic, thank you, Kay. I've turned my camera off, so hopefully that helps in terms of the stability of my connection. Aman, is there anything you would add to that? Because I know that you described the main policy recommendations from this research, and both really have quite profound implications for the role of the DWP in the future, don't they?
Absolutely. I think that the DWP and the way they work and sort of how the benefit system works is a huge driver of insecure work. So Katy's done great work around this, right? So if benefit claimants move into work, it creates a power imbalance between employers and employees, because employers know they can get away with providing insecure, poor quality work, because claimants don't often have the option of leaving that work because they face the threat of sanctions. And so that's, I think, highly problematic. And therefore, I think the DWP, reform of the DWP, is a huge priority for this government. And they've been making, they've talked a lot about the importance of providing employment support. But I think in addition to that, there needs to be a review of the punitive aspects of the welfare system, and there needs to be they need to ensure that benefit claimants have a base of like financial security. UC is often inadequate to live on, and that creates sort of stresses of their own. So I think sort of making sure there aren't any real-term cuts to working age benefits is also very important.
And was really helpful, Aman. We've also had a sort of a question stroke, a kind of point made in the Q&A around the sort of multiple insecurities that people in these circumstances can face, including around housing, their sort of wider finances, etc. And of course, reinforcing that point that you made earlier around it being concentrated in particular places. How should we be feeling, given we have seen some action proposed, for example, around rents and around the kind of housing market? Do you feel like the government does understand the fact that the kind of multidimensional nature of this insecurity challenge that many workers are facing?
Is that to me or Aman? I think it's to Aman.
Oh, sorry, to Aman.
Yeah, so I think from our previous research, we know that there's a great interaction between housing insecurity and work insecurity, and insecure workers often find themselves trapped in the private rented sector. So I think that certainly in terms of employment support and health support, the government seems to be quite proactive on that front. But I think overall, when it comes to the low-paid workers at the lower end of the scale, the quality of work is extremely important. And I think that there's been a lot of progress on pushing people out of low pay with increases to the minimum wage. But I think there needs to be a more holistic approach looking at other factors that affect the quality of working lives. And I think that's where the employment bill is really important.
Yeah. Aman, I'm going to come back to you in a second just to ask about some of the age demographic findings in the work before we look to wrap up the event. But Katy, there's a couple of questions in here around sort of other kinds of connections to different policy areas. So, for example, around transport and being able to better connect people to job opportunities. And it makes me think of what you were saying earlier around devolution, and the extent to which actually maybe it's sort of a lot of the answers here lie within regional government and additional devolution over the coming period. Given you're based in Manchester, and obviously, Andy Burnham and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority has led in some of these areas. It would be great to get your reflections on how a more joined up approach and a more devolved approach at that level can really help as well.
Sure. So, I mean, I think fundamentally it comes back to really understanding what people's experiences are and what the barriers are that they face. And often that's, often I think these policies are really designed very much in Westminster in quite an abstract view of, welfare claimants who should look for work for 35 hours a week. And, if their child is a certain age, then this should be the expectation. And, you should be looking for work that's 90 minutes away. Well, 90 minutes can be depending on where you live, that's either a short distance or whether it's reliable or not. And actually, like when you kind of take those policies and put them onto real people in real labour markets, then that's where the issues tend to really come out, and it really just kind of unravels a little bit. So I think that really there's a real opportunity to think about, how do we, what's going to work for these people in different local areas. And I mean, I think, transport, childcare, skills, like we can't be having these discussions about helping people into work if we're not talking about those things as well. So it's not just about what the DWP is doing, it's also about, what other agencies are doing as well. Skills is another thing that we've not really talked about, but I know you've kind of looked at that a bit in this report too. But I think that's another area that was just completely dropped off in terms of how we're supporting people to move into and progress in the labour market. We actually have conditionality rules that mean that you can't. Actually, it was Work Foundation research that showed this very, very clearly.
Yes.
There you go. There you go, an accidental plug for you. But anyway, fantastic report also from the Work Foundation really showed how those conditionality rules actually prevent people from engaging in education and training. And the idea that we've got an employment support system that doesn't help people engage in employment, education and training is just totally mind-boggling. I mean, we talk about, in that context, we talk about engaging in training as kind of dead weight and a kind of, an opportunity cost. And, I mean, I'm sitting here in a higher education institution. We've never talked about education in that way in this sector. So I think, there's a need to join it up. And I think actually really starting in local communities, speaking to people who are directly affected and the people who we directly want to support. So really ensuring, if we're designing a policy that's supposed to be helping people with health conditions and disabilities, that disabled people and people with health conditions are, integral to that policy design is really, really essential going forwards. And I think, hopefully when we see, I think we're probably expecting some kind of pathfinders in the budget tomorrow about how these kind of new local work skills plans are going to work. Hopefully when local policymakers are putting that together, they are making sure that business, workers, unemployed people are absolutely around that table and guiding that policy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katy. And thank you for the accidental plug. It's very good. Aman, to kind of just cover off the question I had around the demographic analysis. So you obviously identified in the report the particular risks for older workers and their sort of longer term trajectories. But I was equally struck in a way by the findings around those in the 16 to 24 bracket, and the number of, particularly in that bracket, the number of workers who remained in insecure work longer than that. Because I think a lot of the narrative around insecure work is that, yes, you might find your first job is in a sort of relatively insecure setting, but you'll probably progress quite quickly into a more secure job. But it looks from the data that for a decent chunk of young people, that maybe isn't the case. And should we be worried about that?
Yeah, I think so. That was one of the more interesting findings of the paper. So they're much more likely to progress out of insecurity compared to the older cohorts. But yet, as you said, there is a huge chunk of young workers who remain in insecurity. And more recently, when we have been looking at the inactivity data, especially due to ill health, we see a lot of young people in that category as well due to mental health issues. And there is this phenomenon of people leaving education and going straight into inactivity. So I think that is a problem that's getting stored up in the future, because as we know, there are lots of scarring effects of youth unemployment, and that really is the prime sort of working age where you make lots of productivity and wage gains. And so I think that is something that we will need to focus on in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aman. So we've got a few minutes left before we bring the event to a close. And I did just want to kind of return in a way to the fact that we have the budget tomorrow. And I think probably more than most fiscal statements over the last few years, this feels particularly important, given it's coming at the beginning of a parliament, and it's a parliament where we have a new government that has pledged some pretty significant reform and a kind of change in direction across these issues that we've been talking about this afternoon. But it's taking place against a very, very challenging backdrop in terms of the public finances. And so it would be great to sort of close off the conversation with just a few reflections on either what you're hoping to see and what you feel we need to see from the budget tomorrow, or what you expect to see at least. And Katy, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I said, yeah, we were chatting before this call, and I said I remained cautiously optimistic. You know, I think for the first time in a long time, it seems that there is at least a political will there to improve the quality of work, and also to really think a bit more clearly about what we want our employment support service to achieve, and centering that around economic growth and good jobs, rather than kind of the more, you know, the kind of more punitive side of things that we've seen previously. There are some exceptions, obviously. So I think, you know, it's that time where we're thinking, actually, what resource is going to be put behind this? And I think, yes, we're in a very difficult fiscal environment, but these policies have really, the way that policies have been structured in the past have really come at a significant financial and social cost over time. And I think when we've been thinking about, you know, we haven't been talking about employment support and productivity in the same sentence, but actually when we think about the things that will help to boost our productivity, it is about job quality, it is about health and well-being, it is about skills. And I think that there's an opportunity really to really kind of reset and put that right. So I think probably repeating a little bit of what I said before, but making sure that actually there is enough resource to really shift the dial from, you know, just pushing people into any job to supporting them into a good job, and making sure that that is, you know, really backed up by some tangible financial commitments, I think is really important. But also, you know, you can't really kind of making sure that people have got a real an adequate level of income as a starting point is absolutely critical, because this, you know, the kind of insecurity from the labour market, we don't want to be matching that with our social security system too. We want to be helping people to respond to that in a positive way. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katy. Aman, in about 60 seconds, what are you looking for tomorrow?
So just following on from that, I think the previous government planned to make 1.3 billion savings in welfare by tightening the WCA work capability assessment eligibility criteria. So I don't think that would be a good idea. So the current government has said they're also going to make welfare savings, but they're not going to inherit those plans specifically. So it'll be interesting to see how they square that circle. And as Katy said, it's very important that we establish a baseline of financial security for those on benefits.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aman. And we're just about going to close on time, which is fantastic. Thank you both of you for such fantastic contributions this afternoon, and of course to Rebecca Florison as well, who is Aman's co-author on this piece of research. Hope you found the conversation valuable. I'm not going to switch my camera back on because I fear that's going to collapse the call ahead of time, but just to say that we do have more research coming out at the Work Foundation before the end of 2024. We have a new piece coming looking at the relationship between employment policies and worker health, and that will hopefully be coming out during November, so please do look out for that. All of the research that we've talked about today is available completely free of charge on the Work Foundation website, so please do check that out as well. And the best way to keep in touch and to make sure you don't miss any of our analysis is to sign up to our newsletter, and you can do that via our website as well. But for now, just to say thank you to Aman and to Katy again, and to all of you for attending, and to have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.